All right, folks, welcome everyone. My name is Ciara McCarthy. I'm with SES Global Services, and we are very excited today to be in collaboration with FSC Australia on this webinar to bring a holistic view of FSC controlled wood and certification. And it's quite exciting because we have several people joining. Obviously, the core group will be within Australia from all of the different states and territories. But also we have folks from New Zealand who are joining, some who attended our webinar about New Zealand the other day, but also further afield. Today we have people from Indonesia and China, India, Malaysia, Japan, the US, and Canada. So it's great to have people's time on here today, and we hope for a very good and productive webinar. We'll kick off with what this webinar is about, and it's exactly what's written on the slide here. The goal is to provide practical tools for all of you to navigate the FSC controlled wood system in the context of Australia. Obviously, with the framework is similar in many regions of the world, and so you may pick up tips as well for how to navigate some of these documents in particular regions. Okay. So today we're going to have an overview of the controlled wood risk assessment framework, specifics in the context of Australia. We'll talk about the specified risk and control measures, which are the key focus points for many of the folks on the call today, whether you're a certificate holder or you're an auditor or you're a consultant or just general interested person on your landscape here. We'll also look at it from an auditing perspective. And at the end, we'll have a quick panel discussion plus a questions and answers session tied into that. So very quickly, some of you have figured out the questions and answers section already by sending me a few messages here. So this is what the questions and answers, or the question box looks like on your GoToWebinar, your interface. So you can type the questions into the box, and we'll answer as many as possible at the Q&A section at the end. And we'll group them depending on the topics, and do our very best to provide guidance on that. Just a note that we obviously can't answer company-specific questions, but general questions we will. If for some reason we are either A, running out of time, or B, need to research a little bit more to ensure that we answer the questions fully, we will answer those offline via an email, which will be sent with the recording of the webinar or shortly thereafter, in case we need a little bit more time on that, so we can get appropriate and accurate answers to you all. So every question, the answers that we have to research and get back to you on, will be sent to all participants of the webinar. So we're all calibrated on that way. Okay. All right, so we'll move into who else is on here apart from myself. We have 4 of us today that are taking part in this webinar presentation, and it's a good chance now to hand over so you hear some other voices and get to know who's helping with the guidance today. So Stefan.
Thanks, Ciara, for that introduction, and thanks everyone for tuning in today. It's really good to see such an interest in the webinar. So to introduce myself, I'm Stefan Jensen. I'm FSC Australia and New Zealand's Policy and Standards Manager. I've been in this role for coming up to 1 year now, but I've been involved with the FSC system in some capacity for the last 10+ years, I believe. So among many other things in this role, I'm responsible for policy development and for our standards. So I take care of the standards, make sure they're up to date, and that's our forest management standard and our national risk assessment. So specifically on the risk assessment, I'm responsible for collecting information related to the NRA. That could be inquiries, comments, and proposals for improvements, and then to evaluate this information to see if there's a need for updating or revising the NRA. Thanks.
Great, Stefan, thank you. Suzette, we've Suzette Weeding here, a member of the working group. If you want to say a quick hello to everyone.
Sure, thanks, Kira. So yes, as Kira mentioned, I'm Suzette Weeding. I was a member of the FSC Australia National Risk Assessment Working Group in the Economic Chamber. So I've been involved with the FSC system for in excess of 10 years, largely as a forest manager. My day job is I'm a General Manager of Land Management with Sustainable Timber Tasmania. My involvement to with FSC also extended back to the National Standards Development Working Group. So that was the group that developed the Australian National Standards. So I was a member of their Economic Chamber and one of the 9 members that developed that standard as well. Thanks, Kira.
Brilliant. We also have Nick on the line here as well.
Yes, hello, Nick Capobianco here on the SCS Global Services Regional Affiliate for Oceania and have been working with SCS for some 12 years. I'm also a Senior Lead Auditor, and most of you would interact with me as certificate holders when it comes to scheduling and organising your annual or initial or re-evaluation audits. I'll be the one asking all the interesting questions to determine the scope of work.
Great, thanks, Nick. And I'm Kira McCarthy. I'm the International Programme Manager with SCS Global Services. I'm a staff member there and have worked extensively with the FSC Controlled Wood programme and system in several different countries and regions. I'm an auditor for forest management, for chain of custody, and for SBP, which is a sustainable biomass program also. And yeah, that's us. That's the team today. So we'll move on to what controlled wood is. So Stefan, you can take it from here.
Yes, I'll just briefly explain the history of control wood and how it came about before talking a little bit about the control wood standard and how it ties in with the national risk assessment. So when FSC started back in 1994, it was built in a very simple system where only wood from FSC certified forests could enter the FSC system. But quite quickly became clear that there wasn't enough certified wood available in the system to meet the increasing demand for certified products. And as a consequence, FSC in 1997 introduced mixing, which enabled, looks like I'm still on, which enabled certain material from non-certified forests to be mixed with certified material. And then in 2004, FSC took the full step of introducing the controlled wood standard to better define the limits of using uncertified materials. So on your right-hand side here, you can see the controlled wood standard, also known as 40005. And in 2004, FSC also introduced the FSC mix label, which you also have on your screen. And that's the label where FSC certified and controlled wood are mixed. So if we move on to the controlled wood standard, that's the standard used by FSC chain of custody certified organizations to source virgin wood or wood fiber without an FSC claim that doesn't come from the 5 unacceptable sources, which you have here on your screen. So I'll just quickly run through those. The first one is illegally harvested wood. Second one is wood harvested in violation of traditional and human rights. Then you have wood harvested in forests where management activities threaten high conservation values. And then there's wood, conversion wood. And then there's wood from forests in which genetically modified trees are planted. So certificate holders source control wood by implementing a due diligence system to evaluate and mitigate risk of using material from these unacceptable sources. So in other words, the control standard requires certificate holders to know where the wood they source comes from, to evaluate the risk that they may source wood in violation of these control categories, and to take action to mitigate or avoid any risk of sourcing unacceptable wood. And now, then obviously the question is, how will a certificate holder know if there's a risk of sourcing wood from these unacceptable sources? And that's where the national risk assessment comes into play. The risk assessment specifies where there's risk, and it provides control measures to avoid or mitigate this risk. So say, for example, you're a company or based in Melbourne or Tokyo or Copenhagen for that matter, and you wish to source control wood from Australia and you're a certificate holder. The NRA helps you by specifying where there's risk in the area that you're sourcing from, and it also provides you with control measures to mitigate this risk. You as a certificate holder then must implement these control measures to mitigate the risk sufficiently, and eventually you'll get audited by a certification body to see whether or not the effectiveness of the mitigation measures you have implemented is okay. So we'll talk a little bit more about the NRA and the risk designations in a bit, but before we get to that, I think Chiara will explain a little bit about how NRAs are developed in the FSC system. So over to you, Chiara.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Stefan. So yeah, so where does the NRA come from? So with the development of FSC's national risk assessments, they come from a framework. It's the development and approval of national risk assessments framework, which is a procedure that FSC International have put together. So national risk assessments are exactly that. They're national or regional, and they have been developed in several countries across the globe. When you have the FSC controlled wood standard, the 40005 as we call it, that standard is applicable across all certificate holders globally, but obviously there are regional differences and national differences in terms of forest management or the types of ecosystems, etc. that exist. So what each country or region have done is, like, there's a working group that is formed. So with the working groups are made up of members or representative from each of the chambers. So there has to be a balance in terms of the members from each chamber, and those are the environmental, social, and economic chambers. So these members make up the working group and assess risk in the context of the country in question. So here we are in Australia, and we have, Suzette on the line here as well, who was a member of that working group. Additionally, there are public consultations for the development of the national risk assessment. I think there are several of these that happen per country, and then feedback is incorporated into the national risk assessment itself, which then it has to go to FSC International for approval. And that process is to make sure that it aligns with the actual standard itself, the FSC controlled wood standard. It's following the procedures in the development and approval of the risk assessment, and that it's calibrated across these two documents and globally, so that there's the standard is being applied equally in each country. The Australian standard or national risk assessment is one of, I think it's between 62 and 65 national risk assessments that have been developed by FSC. A lot of these were in existence for a while, particularly in areas where there has been low risk for all 5 categories. But in 2019, we saw several of the larger ones being approved at a national scale. So Australia being one, Brazil, Vietnam, Canada, the US, New Zealand as well. So I think everyone can appreciate the amount of work that goes on behind the scenes for the national risk assessments. It takes a lot of time, particularly if you're in a country that has extensive specified risk. It's a heavy process, a lot of stakeholder consultation, and these things take time. So actually, to talk to the slide here, you will see all of these different points, and they're not too dissimilar to what a certificate holder might have to do actually when they're developing their due diligence system. So this is also done at the national scale. So for Australia, the scope was determined as the entire country, including all of the states and territories. It's an information gathering process. The areas are grouped in terms of homogeneous risk. So all of the area of low risk or specified risk. And then there's actually, how do you designate the risk in each of the different categories? Now, the categories 1 to 5, as Stefan was talking about on the last slide, they're actually further broken down by indicators. So for example, category 1 has, I think, 21 indicators. Category 3 has 6 different indicators. And each of these indicators in the procedural document, this one here in the center, has guidance and references around the threshold that these have to meet in order to be deemed as low risk. And if through the information gathering and looking at all of those aspects as the working group look at these, if a particular area or particular indicator, I should say, is not meeting those thresholds, then they are deemed specified risk. And that's how it works. So every single indicator goes through this process to ensure that they're adequately researched and the risk can be determined. The next step as well, the working group and FSC go through, is the establishment of control measures. So what type of mitigation or control measures could be used in a particular country or region in order to bring the risk from specified risk to low risk, the low risk of sourcing from any of the 5 categories for controlled wood. The last point on the slide here is about the 6-month implementation period. So according to the FSC controlled wood standard 40005, an organization has 6 months in which to become aligned with the national risk assessment for where they're sourcing. For Australia, the national risk assessment was approved on the 30th of June 2019. And so 6 months on from there is the 30th of December. So we are well into the period now of time where all certificate holders must be using the national risk assessment for Australia if you're sourcing from Australia, meaning the certificate holder must know the district of origin, what types of risks are associated there, what types of control measures, having implemented these control measures, mitigation measures, and coming up to an audit. These are the types of things that would be looked at there. I'll just pop onto the next slide. Again, so there's a risk assessment framework acknowledgement. It is a large scale, it is at a national scale, and there may be nuances or more granular information available from certificate holders or landowners, and these must be communicated in your due diligence system. So the framework acknowledges this. It's built on the best management practices or best available information in terms of data quality and availability. The scale of the assessment is at state or national scale, down to state, down to regional forest types, etc. The difference between low risk and no risk. So this is something that it does come up a lot. There has to be a low risk. Again, we talked about those thresholds that are met or not met in terms of something being low or specified risk. So a low risk is when a control measure is implemented and it brings the likelihood right down for certain values being impacted by forestry or sourcing. So low risk, there has to be a low risk of sourcing from any of the controversial sources of controlled wood, which is the 5 categories. But the no risk is about mixing in the supply chain. Okay, so there can be no mixing in the supply chain, but a low risk of sourcing from the 5 categories of controlled wood. And the framework, or the national risk assessment, or the procedures also acknowledge the complexity in the supply chains. Some organizations with controlled wood may be sourcing directly from the forest. Others may be a lot further from the stump, coming back 2 or 3 links in the supply chain. So the complexity is recognized. It's not a one size fits all, and it has been designed in that way so that it can be used depending on location in the supply chain, and different approaches may be necessary. Just one last point here that we want to acknowledge. There are several hundred links in the National Risk Assessment itself, in that document. Quite a few are not working at the moment, and the FSC are working to have these repaired. A server got moved somewhere in the background. I'm sure everyone on the call can sympathize when that happens, but they are being repaired. The problem is they're aware of the problem, and it is being worked on. So I'm sure an email will go out to everybody when that's all singing and dancing again. So, all right, Stefan, I think it's over to you again. And can you confirm, have you control of the mouse, or? Yep.
Can you?
Okay.
Yes. Looks like that'll work.
There you go.
Yep.
All right. Thanks.
So again, we're talking about risk, and this is really when we get into it. So you can see here that the NRA specifies risk in 3 of the 5 categories. So category 1, 3, and 4. And it specifies low risk in 2 and 5. And we'll dig into those in a little bit. But first, I'll just try and take you to the risk assessment itself, to the document, to give you an impression of what it looks like and how to use it. Can be it's an extensive.
Help you there with that. So get that up here in the background. Oopsie. And here you go. Okay, hopefully everyone can see the national risk assessment up there. Yep.
So as you'll see, it's a quite extensive body of work, 271 pages, and a lot of work has gone into it. But the thing is, you don't need to be across this whole document. And I'll show you a little bit about how you can use it. But first, here's the front page. So we have the National Risk Assessment, and as Chiara said, it's developed according to this procedure. You'll see that we're at version 1.1. It started as 1.0, so we've had a small revision. And like Chiara said, we've got around 100 pages of dead links in the document, which will be updated in due course, and then we'll send out another version. So this is a good time to remind you to always make sure you use the most recent version of the document, and it does get updated every now and then. So you'll read that in our newsletter or our social media, or you can just go to the link that Chiara's given you to get the most recent version of the document. So if we try and go through it, we get to the contents on page 2. And you'll see there's a little bit of an introduction to begin with, and I can only recommend that you read that. And then it starts digging into the different categories, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if you look into the specific category, you'll see there's a bit of introduction again, and then the actual risk assessment starts on page 17 and finishes on 71. So this is where the argument is built for either specifying risk or specifying, specifying low risk. Like Chiara said, there's 21 indicator in this category. 18 of them have low risk. So a lot of this is basically building an argument for specifying low risk, and it's not something you need to be across per se, but obviously if it's something you're interested in, or if you need to understand a little bit more about why the specified risk, you can look into the work of the working group here. And then finally we have the control measures, which is what you must use to mitigate risk. And then if we just pop down here, here's the summary of the risk across the whole the risk assessment. So that's broken up into the 5 categories. And if we just try and think of an example, say you're wanting to source pine from a plantation in Queensland, this summary of risk gives you a pretty good indication of the scope of work ahead of you. So if you look at it, in category 1, we have specified risk in 3 places. None of them relates to Queensland as Northern Territory and WA. So there's no specified risk under indicator 1 or category 1. Category 2, there's low risk across the board. Then you get into category 3 where there's quite a bit of specified risk. But if you start looking at it, there's low risk here. 3.1, low risk for all softwood plantations. So if you're sourcing pine from Queensland, you're fine. Again, 3.2, low risk. 3.3, I believe that's low risk as well. And then the specified risk in 3.4 and 6, and low risk in 3.5. You have specified risk in 4.1, and then low risk again in 5. So I think that adds up to 4 or 5 specified risks you have to mitigate if you're sourcing from Queensland. And then just finally, I'll show you up here what the mandatory control measures look like. Sorry about that. So you can click here, page 1. So here are the mandatory control measures. So they're at the very end of each control wood category for you to read. Yeah, and that's pretty much it for the document. So you don't have to read it from page 1 to page 271 and understand every word of it. You can kind of use it as you need to mitigate risk.
That's a good point, Stefan, with the size of these documents, because it has all of the information behind why things are specified or low risk. But again, it can be intimidating. But the key points are, as you said, the summary of where the risk is. I know I have every single page with control measures bookmarked in order to be able to navigate the document. But it's it's a good point for a tip for everyone, auditors alike, to be able to navigate this.
Perfect. If you want to take me back to the slide deck, Chiara, please. So we'll try and go through the specified risks in each category now. So I'll try and explain where the specified risk is, and then Chiara will chip in and try to give an auditor's perspective on how this will be audited. So I'll just pop over.
Okay, I think you're back on the, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So like I mentioned, category 1, illegally harvested wood, there's 21 indicators. 18 are deemed to have low risk, and then there's 3 with specified risk, as we saw just before. That's 1.3, 1.4, and 119. So just try and take them one by one. So under 1.3, management and harvesting planning, the NRA working group found that pretty much across the board, everything is looking pretty good here, low risk, with the one exception of being the Northern Territory, where they quote the CSIRO, who said that there's a code that provides a set of relevant goals, but there's no guidance on how these effectively link into legislation or how they can be translated into plans and on-ground practices. So the mandatory control measure here is to ensure that a timber harvest plan is developed and implemented for the Northern Territory, meaning that if you're sourcing from the Northern Territory, you have to make sure that there's a timber harvest plan developed and implemented. Do you want to add something to that one, Chiara?
Yeah, I think from an auditing perspective, the tangible evidence for us would be you can see their timber harvest plan, but the point above it where it talks about what the code for the Northern Territory didn't provide or doesn't provide guidance on how these effectively link to legislation. So the evidence there is like, it's saying about plans and on the ground practices. So it would be, documentation or evidence of these types of harvest plans, and field verification as well. So it's those kind of key words that stick out to me as an auditor on the types of evidence that I would look for, and certificate holders might need to think about on that one.
Thanks. We'll move on to the next one. 1.4 for harvesting permits. And again, across the board, the NRA working group found this to be pretty good and low risk, with one exception being sandalwood from Western Australia. And if you want to read more about this, you can have a look in the NRA, but just briefly, there's been some issues with legality in WA with harvesting of sandalwood and export. And this has prompted the working group to give this a specified risk. And then again, we go on to the control measures. And Chiara, I actually think you found a little bit of clarification on the control measures this morning. Is that correct? Or maybe Suzette can chip in here?
Yeah, it was around the stakeholder consultation for this particular indicator. So often when we see stakeholder consultation written in a standard or in a national risk assessment, it can come out in two different ways. And some of the certificate holders on here will be used to conducting stakeholder consultation at a very broad scale. But when we look at this, you have the 3 points here on the screen. So authorities are confirming validity of harvesting licenses. There's independent field inspection, shall confirm A, B, and C. Again, it's tangible evidence. It's like field inspection, yes, but is it documented? Can you show us that? But the stakeholder consultation piece here is essentially talking to the relevant stakeholder. It could be a local authority who has issued a license or permit to the harvesting entity that has harvested the sandalwood in this instance. So it's not a broad scale emailing all of your list on opinions on or stakeholder consultation on the practice. This is a very factual based direct consultation with the relevant authority to get that piece of evidence, which in this case we'll call it license. I mean, there's different words in different regions, I acknowledge that, but to have that as a piece of evidence for that. So it's the stakeholder consultation is appropriate. It has to be appropriate to the amount of how far back you have to go to get that evidence. Okay, so Another question that might come up here, I'm just thinking with certificate holders, do you have to do this every year? Well, in this case, if you're harvesting in different coops or different using different harvesting companies for sandalwood every year, like yes, we would require that there was evidence of a license to harvest in that particular area, and it is likely that it would be required every year in order to reach conformance. Okay, but it's very much a direct stakeholder consultation. Okay. Suzette, did you want to add anything on that, or have we captured it? It's always good to hear a bit from the working group as well. Or
yeah, no problem, Kira. So exactly as Kira has said, it's really that targeted consultation, and it's as appropriate to the operation that's being undertaken. So it's you know, identifying that that there's an appropriate authority to issue that permission, whether it be a license or a permit or whatever process is being run. And then you're just confirming that is in place for the activity that's being undertaken, in this case the harvesting of the sandalwood, and then that information is valid and relevant for that operation.
great, thanks.
Thanks for that. We'll quickly move on to the last specified risk in this category. So it has to do with custom regulations, and again, low risk across the country, apart from wild sandalwood in Western Australia, where we've seen already there's been some issues with illegal harvesting. And that again means that there's two control measures, and obviously that this has to do with legality. So all required export permits and related documents shall be in place, and all processors of regulated timber products must comply with the requirements of the Illegal Logging Act. So basically to make sure that it's a legal product. I don't know if you want to add anything here, Kiara.
I suppose it's worth mentioning that if you don't have to be in Western Australia to hold your controlled wood certification. You could sit in Queensland, you could sit in Japan, or the US or somewhere, and be sourcing sandalwood from Western Australia. So if you're the controlled wood certificate holder or seeking to be a controlled wood certificate holder, you would need to provide evidence of this. So the export permits and any of those documentation requirements in order to be in conformance. It's just to make that clear, you don't have to be, and that goes across for any control measure. Okay.
Thanks, and we'll quickly move on to control wood category 2, so wood harvested in violation of traditional and human rights. So here the working group looked at 3 different indicators and found that there's low risk across the country, and when there's low risk, there's no provided control measures, so that's not applicable. But this is also a good opportunity to say that it's important to note that low risk doesn't mean no risk. There's always a potential risk of, let's say, this one has to do with violation of traditional human rights, that there's some human right violations going on that the working group wasn't aware of, like obviously almost by nature being illegal, they would happen out of sight of most people. So just saying that low risk doesn't mean no risk. And as a certificate holder, you're not required to solicit additional information beyond the national risk assessment. But if you become aware of issues, you're not allowed to ignore them either. And they have to be mitigated. And obviously, since there's no control measures provided, you'll have to develop your own control measures, which will have to live up to scrutiny by your certification body. And then we'll move on to, I think it took away my rights to change.
It should be still there.
Oh, if you could just hop on to the next slide.
Yeah, sure. Sorry. couple of questions about the PowerPoint coming in that will links be provided. We can PDF a copy to people, and it's also being recorded, and that will be sent to everybody as well, just for those of you furiously writing notes.
So we move on to category 3, which has to do with high conservation values. And as you'll probably be aware, there's the national risk assessment, but then there's the evaluation framework, which has to do with high conservation value, which is in a way aligned to our standard for forest management. But Suzette has offered to kind of explain how this is all connected.
Sure, no problem at all. So those people with some familiarity with the controlled wood assessments would know that previously there was an assessment framework for high conservation values in relation to controlled wood. As part of the national standards development process, we actually saw this as a good and effective approach to assess high conservation values in a stepwise and consistent manner across the board. So for the national standards process, as part of Principle 9, which is assessing or the requirements around high conservation values, the management and of high conservation values, we adopted and incorporated a high conservation values assessment framework and an approach in there, which lays out essentially for each of the high conservation value categories the means of which, so what are the high conservation values under each of those categories, the information that you'd need to source in order to identify whether you've got those high conservation values within your forest management unit, and then the way you would manage those values should you identify them within your management unit. Similarly, for the controlled wood process, essentially what we did was replicate as much as we possibly could under the National Risk Assessment process that high conservation value evaluation framework. So trying to maintain that consistency between the two documents as best as we can. For those that have reviewed them side by side, you'll note there are some differences between those documents, and that's essentially linked on the basis of controlled wood being a requirement that your management activities don't threaten high conservation values. And under the National Standards Development process, essentially it's a requirement to maintain and or enhance those high conservation values. So there's some fundamental differences there in terms of, the requirements to manage or, avoid those values in relation to your harvesting activities, or avoid impacts to those values in relation to your harvesting activities. The other component of which was important when developing the risk assessment, the controlled wood evaluation framework, was the fact that we don't have the remainder of the standards. So in the national standards process, we have Principle 9, which is how you manage high conservation values, Principle 6, which is around managing environmental impacts. For the evaluation framework, it's very much looking at implementation of recommended and mandatory control measures around particular values in the absence of having that broader framework for managing values, which would give you full forest management certification for those areas. So just to reiterate, it's essentially trying to maintain consistency between the two approaches. Consistency in terms of the designations and the values under the high conservation value categories, and consistency in the approach in terms of the steps that you go through to assess those values. Stefan?
Yep, thanks. So we'll try and jump into category 3, and just a little bit of a summary before we jump into the assessment framework. You can see the risk designations here, and you can see there's quite a bit of a specified risk in this category, which is probably not a surprise, as high conservation values have always been a big concern in Australia because of all the ecoregions and the variety of ecoregions across the state. But here's a broad overview of the risk designations. And if you just want to jump to the next slide, Kiara. The assessment framework also takes scale, intensity, and risk into consideration. As it says here, the high conservation framework designates supply areas as fitting into one of two classes for scale, intensity, or risk. So it's low SIR and standard scale, intensity, and risk. So low SIR is generally used in the FSC system to recognize that the smaller the area of the management unit is and the lower the intensity and frequency of activities are in the forest, the lower is the risk of negative impacts. And that effectively means that while standard SIR supply areas have to use every risk designation in the framework, for low SIR, the specific designations they are required to, and then there's other to be assessed on, and then there's other designations where they're not required. So down the bottom here, you can see what it takes to qualify for low scale, intensity, and risk. So that is that your wood source must be plantation only, so not native forest, plantation only, and be sourced from a supply area smaller than 1,000 hectares, or where annual harvest is less than 5,000 cubic meters. And just to explain here that 1,000 hectares can be across several plantations. Is the aggregate supply area. It's not the size of each individual plantation, it's the aggregate. And the same with the 5,000 cubic meters, it's across the plantations. Yeah, and then if you just want to jump to the next one, Kiara.
Stefan, do you have control of the mouse there?
Yeah, I can't change the slides. Now I can. Oh, it's back. Yep. So before we jump into to the assessment framework, just a reminder that you can still ask questions, and in the interest of time and recognizing that this is fairly technical stuff, we won't go through the assessment framework to the letter, but we've picked 3 high conservation values that we'll take a closer look at. If you have any questions regarding those or regarding some of the other values, please pop them in the question box and we'll address them in the Q&A section later on.
Great, and we're seeing a couple of questions coming in already, so that's really great. They're good questions for the discussion.
Brilliant, thanks.
Yep.
So here it is, the high conservation values evaluation framework, and as it says, it's for the use in the context of implementing control wood standards. So the National Risk Assessment says that there's mandatory control measures for all 6 categories, and it refers to this document for those control measures. So we start off with an introduction, and as it says, it's a normative annex to the National Risk Assessment. And then it also says that it's for organizations sourcing chain of custody certified organizations, certified to 40005, but also for forests certified to 30010. And Kiara, you kindly offered to explain what this is about.
Sure, yeah. So there are essentially the 2 controlled wood standards, the 40005, the chain of custody controlled wood, and then the 3010, which is more on the forest management aspect. So the difference traditionally was the 3010 was developed for organizations that own lands or have exclusive management rights to the forest management, and operates on a more principles and criteria basis. So it's quite similar to the forest management standard, and it has often been seen as a way, particularly for organizations that are new to certification, and they're seeking FSC 100% certification, that this was a stepping stone towards that, to get used to the system and build the environmental management system. The 40005 controlled wood for chain of custody has been designed for entities that are further up that supply chain, that you may have several suppliers sourcing from different forests, or maybe the same forest, but you don't have actual management rights to that forest. So that's why there's two different standards essentially for controlled wood. And this was all prior to there being a national risk assessment for Australia. So.
Thanks for that. So yeah, so we look through the document. We've got the introduction and background here. Try and scroll down a little bit. So context of the framework. Suzette already touched on this to say that there's no requirement to enhance HCVs in the control wood system, only to maintain them, unlike the full forest management standard, where you have to enhance and or maintain, or maintain and or enhance. And yeah, we've touched upon the two different standards here already. And here we have the summary of risk again, which I also showed you on the slide deck.
And the high conservation value framework is for category 3. It's as a document linked to category 3 for controlled wood. It's a separate document from the National Risk Assessment. And again, you can download that on the link that we provided as an answer to one of Stephen asked the question. So if you want to get a copy of it.
And then, as you see here, for control wood implementation, the organization shall use assessment to identify the presence of high conservation values in the supply area and control wood forest management units. This framework presents a required approach for assessment of each high conservation value. So that's what we get to in the next part of the document, this approach for assessment. And then just to highlight here, while the identification of the presence of a high conservation value doesn't automatically exclude harvesting, it's the responsibility of the forest manager to demonstrate that a high conservation value will be effectively maintained by the proposed control measures and using the precautionary principle. So that's just to say that because there's a high conservation value, that doesn't necessarily mean you can't harvest in it. You just have to make sure that the high conservation value is maintained. But with some high conservation values, their presence just simply isn't compatible with harvesting. And then the next part is scale, intensity, and risk. We've covered that already. And then we have the references here. And there's a few overriding notes. And then we get to the definitions part. So when you look through the document, you'll see that there's terms and concepts followed by an asterisk, and that means that they've been defined, so you can find them in the definitions here or in the definitions under each high conservation value. So we're just looking through all the definitions here, and then we get down to the 6 high conservation values. And because the format really repeats itself for each high conservation value, I'll just try and show you how each of them, how this one is built up, and then we'll dig into to the actual high conservation value. So you'll see here that the high conservation value is described, and then we have 2 tables, and in a moment I'll just ask Suzette to explain the purpose of these 2 tables, but I'll just show you the whole section first. And then we have another lot of definitions pertaining to this specific high conservation value. And then like Suzette mentioned, the working group has provided a list of best available information for you to use to mitigate the risk in this high conservation value. So you can see there's recovery plans and related documents, databases, peer-reviewed journals and articles, field surveys. So there's a whole list of information you can use to mitigate risk. And here's the second of those two tables I mentioned. And then towards the end, down here, we have control measures. So of the 6 high conservation values, 5 of them have a recommended and a mandatory control measure. The first one here only has a recommended control measure. And we're currently developing a mandatory control measure for this one as well. That's pending board approval and approval by FSC International. So keep an eye on our webpage and make sure that when and if the document is revised, you make sure that you use this mandatory control measure if it is implemented. So I'll just go back up again. So you see these two
just
tables
on
here.
that point, Stefan. Sorry. Just to like from you know, auditor glasses on that one. If there's specified risk in an area and there is a recommended control measure, which, as you said, will be changing to mandatory. Just because it's recommended doesn't mean that you don't do anything. If there's specified risk, some control measure must be put in place. So that might be something that, you know, good to know ahead of time before an audit happens. But in terms of an auditing perspective, if there's specified risk, mitigation is required.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It is obviously, as the high conservation or the national risk assessment says, it is mandatory to mitigate this risk. In this specific high conservation value, there's no mandatory control measure, but it's still mandatory to mitigate the risk. And I'll just now handball it over to you, Suzette, if that's okay to describe this table, and then we'll scroll down to the next one afterwards.
Sure, no problem at all. And just to add to that point around the recommended and mandatory control measures, I think with the risk assessment working group, we found that some of the values were quite easy to put in consistent mandatory control measures which could apply across the board. And then others, you know, and the rationale for a recommended control measure was on the basis of people developing site-specific control measures that are relevant to the value that they're trying to protect and manage. So it's not about ignoring it, as Kira said. It's about, you know, applying something that is relevant to the area that you're managing and the particular value that you've got within your sourcing area. So in terms of these tables, so the first table, which is table 2 here on the screen, so this refers to the categories of high conservation values, and these are as defined by FSC International. So your first one is essentially a designation category to give you a means of tracking that in your assessment documentation. A description of what the high conservation value is. So under high conservation value 1, you know, we've got 5 specific designations or values that are assessed underneath that high conservation value. And the third part of the table is essentially a view as to whether the low scale intensity risk group need to assess for that particular value. The rationale for having a low scale intensity risk, it's something that is well recognised within the FSC system, and it provides a means of those landowners, forest managers, forest owners who've got a relatively small area, which we know based on experience have low risk of containing certain values. And therefore low risk that that harvesting activities will impact on those values, meant that we were able to define or to, I guess, make it a more simplified means of assessment for those particular forest owners or forest managers. It's not about making it easier for them, but it's essentially a recognition of risk as per the area that they're managing and the likelihood that they'll encounter those particular values. So down to the second table.
Just hopping down there now. Whoop.
Yeah. So this is the assessment pathway, and people familiar with the national standard will see, you know, fairly similar sort of process. And essentially it sets out for both the low scale intensity risk group or the, you know, the standard scale intensity risk, the assessment pathways that you follow to assess whether you've got high conservation values within your you know, sourcing area or your management unit. So essentially going through that process of consulting your best available information. As Stefan pointed out earlier, there's a range of information sources. Not all of them have to be used, but it's essentially working through a process to identify the best available information that's relevant to your management area, and to prepare lists and maps of your potential high conservation values. For your low scale intensity risk, then essentially it's identifying what control measures you need to maintain those identified high conservation values. Undertaking stakeholder consultation, and again, that's you know, it's obviously to be assessed by the auditors, but in terms of process there, I mean, the reality is it's as relevant to the area that you're managing and the values that you identify, and then that process of implementing your control measures. In addition to that, for the standard risk, just on the next page, please. As you'd see, it's a more complex process with a few more steps in there. So again, similar process around identifying, you know, or consulting your best available information, consulting your experts. If you need to, undertaking a gap analysis. So again, it's recognising that, you know, Australia is a broad country, and various areas will have various chances of particular values. In this case, you know, threatened species or other species that are of significance or values of significance. Identifying, you know, what additional assessments you might require in order to come up with an assessment of high conservation values within that area. Next step is a threat assessment. So how likely are your management activities to impact upon that value or the identified high conservation values? Work through a process to identify your control measures, consult stakeholders, again relevant to what you're undertaking, and then work through implementing those control measures. So it's meant to be quite a systematic pathway to provide people guidance as to how to firstly identify what are high conservation values that might occur within your area, but then secondly to work through a process of, well, now that I may have high conservation values, what's the process that I work through to identify them, work out what the risk is, what management measures I actually require in that area, and to consult in relation to those activities.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. And I think we kind of covered the content of this one. So I'll just, do you want to add anything to the recommended control measure, Chiara?
Not essentially, but yes. Suzette, you were talking there about, you know, the pathway, how it's followed, what is the process, what management activities were put in place, and you know, that's a really clear line there. And like, from again, auditor goggles on over here, that's exactly what we would be auditing, is like, how was this pathway followed? What kind of assessment, or what was the process? How was that documented? And how did you, you know, the logical sequence and to come to whatever management activities that were put in place, whether it's a void or whether it's doing something else, that we can see that sequence as well. So if that's helpful.
Brilliant. And just in the interest of time, it looks like we're running a bit short. We'll try and get through the rest of this document relatively quickly. So got high conservation value 2 here, and you can see here there's mandatory control measures under this. But apart from that, it follows the exact same structure as the other high conservation value. So we have high conservation value 3 here, which has to do with ecosystems and habitats. And again, like structure repeats, you have the designations for low SIR. Some are required, some aren't. And then the definitions. And then again, there's a list of best available information that you can refer to. And then we have the assessment pathway, followed by the control measures. So here again, we have recommended control measures and the mandatory control measures. Do you want to tie in a comment here, or do you just want to jump to the next one, Kira?
Oh, sorry, I'm muted. Yeah, so I mean, mandatory control measures must be put in place at a minimum, and then the recommended control measures are a level on top of that as well, depending on the type of risk that is being mitigated. So here you can see that the mandatory control measure for old growth is first off that you cannot source old growth as per the definition. You can follow that with the asterisks, but it is permissible under certain management activities, include like small scale, like safety or access. It may be justified, and there's a minimum threshold for old growth in high conservation value areas. So that's where the recommended control measure would come into play on top of the mandatory. So they're in sequence. The recommended control measure here wouldn't be mandatory naturally because of if it's large scale old growth, that's not allowed under the standard here.
Okay, I'll just see if I can take us down to number 6. And I hope this helps to demystify this document. I think it's really good to know that the structure repeats all the way through, and it really has these tables that quite clearly sets out what the control measures are. So it's fairly easy to, if you see in the risk designations that there's a specified risk in your area, you can quickly look at the assessment framework and see what risks you need to mitigate. So here we have high conservation value 6, cultural values, and once again we have the designations to be assessed for low SIR, 3 required, 3 not required. So the required ones are historic values of global or national cultural and or archaeological significance, long-term research sites, and spiritual and cultural values. And definitions, best available information, and then again you have the assessment pathway split up into low SIR and standard scale intensity and risk. And then we get back to the recommended and the mandatory control measures. Do you want to add anything here, Chiara, before you take us back?
Sure. So in this control measure here, and in some we'll see this and or directive. So for this particular one, like it's recognized that certain organizations or entities will have a relationship with the indigenous communities who are involved in forest management. And then in other areas that, or depending on where you are on the supply chain as well, that relationship may not be there. So the or as directed by state and national laws here, it is looking at using existing protocols that are available to certificate holders. So for example, like Tasmania or in Victoria, you've got in Tasmania, the Forest Practices Authority. I mean, there's a protocol there on managing cultural values, and just from an auditor perspective again, we would be looking at, you know, how are these protocols or measures followed and put into place, or if there is direct consultation as well, like the records or documentation around that as well. Suzette, did you want to add anything on this particular section?
No, probably just to reiterate what you said there around,
yep.
Yeah, that process and those processes that already exist and are in place around how those particular values are managed, whether it be you know, an artifact scatter or a site of more significance.
Mm-hmm. And just to clarify, I did say Victoria and Tasmania, and obviously there's New South Wales, Queensland, and all the other areas. I decided not to list all of the states and territories in one go there. So yeah, but there are protocols in different states. All right, so we're heading back to the presentation.
Yes, please.
All right. Oh, swap. Now. All right, you should have control. Here's our friend, the question box. So it's just a reminder again, because you know, going through the high conservation value framework, you know, is an additional but very helpful document, and to understand how it works, the different how the pattern repeats, and the very good information that is in there to help meet the standard and help certificate holders to navigate that particular category in the Australian context. But if there are questions, again, pop them into the questions box, and we'll get to them later. They're anonymous, you know, we're not going to call anyone out. So feel free to add.
Perfect. And we'll quickly move on to category 4. So that's conversion wood. And in this category, the working group assessed one indicator. So that's conversion of natural forests to plantations on non-forest use in the area under assessment is less than 0.02% of 5,000 hectares, average net annual loss for the past 5 years, whichever is less. And the working group found that there's low risk in the ACT and specified risk in the rest of the states and the Northern Territory. And the reasons for the specified risk varies across the states and the Northern Territory, but you can find the arguments or the reasoning behind it in the National Risk Assessment, but to a large degree, and especially in Queensland, Victoria, New South Wales, it has to do with the more relaxed laws around land clearing, where land clearing is quite rampant in certain places, and it is highly likely that timber derived from clearing of private forests will enter the supply chain. So obviously, as someone sourcing from these areas, your role is to mitigate the risk of this land clearing timber entering your supply chain. So the control measure is that organizations must demonstrate that no conversion wood is entering the supply chain through field inspections and/or document verification. And you're welcome to add something here, Kira, if you want to.
To me, this is pretty clear. Like, there's field inspections and documentation. That's probably delivery tickets and et cetera, from certificate holders, and it's tracing that back the supply chain to the necessary entity to show that evidence to be in conformance. One note is it is specified risk for all of Australia. Or low risk in ACT. Okay. This kind of reiterates the point of it's hard, you can't map conversion, you know, before it happens. So it's that area where if there is timber that is coming from a converted source and you know about it and your auditor will know about it, then mitigation measures must be put in place. You know, it is low risk in ACT, but it's low risk, not no risk. But if there was anything to change there, and a certificate holder does know that it's coming from a area being converted from forest use to non-forest use, well then, you know, mitigation measures are required. Okay.
Perfect. And that brings us to the last category, which has to do with genetically modified trees, where the working group looked at one indicator, no commercial use of genetically modified trees. And across the board, they found that there's low risk in Australia, and consequently, there's no applicable control measures. And that brings us to the end of the 5 categories, and I'll let Nick take over from here.
Thank you, Stefan. So as you can see, there's a fair bit of planning that goes into establishing a controlled wood program, certainly in Australia, and there's a little bit of planning that goes in to organising an audit. So I'm going to explain a little bit about what to expect. Firstly, in order to be for an FSC chain of custody certificate holder to achieve controlled wood certification, they need to be audited to 3 standards. 40004 is the chain of custody standard that describes the management system and traceability requirements for the chain of custody. FSC 50001 is the trademark standard that describes the trademark rules and conditions related to selling and making claims about FSC controlled wood. And then, of course, the FSC controlled wood standard 40005, which explains the requirements for the FSC due diligence system to avoid materials from the unacceptable sources. So first, geographic area of supply. For each controlled wood evaluation or surveillance audit, we will reach out to certificate holders to collect information to determine the scope of the assessment. And firstly, we need to know information about the geographic area, the tree species, and the type of forest where the trees are harvested. FSC calls this the supply area. And this information is necessary to determine the applicable FSC national risk assessment for that area, and where necessary, if there's any specified risks. In this case, in Australia, the applicable FSC national risk assessment is the NRA AU version 1.1, issued on the 30th of June 2019. So the panel has given an overview of the Australian National Risk Assessment and some of the specified risks, specifically the risks for Category 1, 3, and Category 4. In some cases, the species or the forest type may result in a low risk for a category indicator. Take, for example, indicator 3.1 for HCVs, where native forest and hardwood plantations in New South Wales and Queensland are identified as specified risk. Obviously, appropriate control measures apply. Whereas for hardwood plantations in all other states and any softwood plantations in Australia, 3.1 indicator is low risk. So the level of information provided is very important. Next, we also need to understand the fibre flow in the supply chain from the forest to the certificate holder's site. Take, for example, a wood chip exporter who sources and chips their own logs, but also buys wood chip residues from other uncertified sawmills. We need to know who those third-party sawmills are and their activities, and the control measures implemented to ensure that there is no risk of mixing or substitution in their supply chain for the material that's coming from your supply area. So that takes us to the due diligence information. We will request a copy of the certificate holder's controlled wood public summary and due diligence system, which describes the forest areas, the species and the risk assessment, and all of the relevant control measures implemented to mitigate the risks at the supplier level, and as well as the supply chain. And then once we have that information and we've analysed all of that information, we'll determine the sample of FMUs and or SLIMFs to conduct field verification visits to assess the implementation of those control measures. And we'll also assess the suppliers in the fibre flow to the certificate holder's site to verify measures to rule out mixing or substitution. And lastly, where the wood is sourced from a supply area that is identified as specified risk, then the certifying body is required to conduct stakeholder consultation at the time of the initial evaluation audit or the re-evaluation audit on the 5th year. For this, we request the certificate holder to provide a list of their stakeholders to combine with our own for an effective stakeholder consultation. And all of this information is required about 8 weeks prior to the audit to allow the certifying body to conduct at least 6 weeks of stakeholder consultation. And on that note, I'll hand over to Kira to talk about the stakeholder consultation.
Great, thanks, Nick. Right, so it's really reiterating what Nick has pointed out on the previous slide. So a certification body, which is us as SES Global or another certification body, when conducting a controlled wood audit of an organization that is sourcing from an area of specified risk, stakeholder consultation is required by the certification body for evaluations and re-evaluations. So it's kind of reiterating everything there. The document that we use for the stakeholder consultation is the certificate holder's public summary. So we do require that 8 weeks out from the planned audit date in order to ensure that we have the scoping and logistics and all of that in line. And the public summary is, so there's a little bit of information on there that if you are a member of the public and you want to know a little bit more about the company and or the organization who has controlled wood or seeking controlled wood, what are they doing? So in this document, there will be information on where the company is sourcing from, what types of risks have been identified there, and information on the control measures that have been implemented, information on any experts that may have been used to help implement control measures or assess their adequacy, and information on any stakeholder consultation process that has occurred. So all of that information is in the public summary for the certificate holder. It ties back to section 6 of the 40005 standard, all of the requirements in there. And that's required because it goes out to the public. It is sent out via email. It is put up on SCS website, and members of the public can make comment. The additional document that you do not, a certificate holder does not have to supply, of course, is the National Risk Assessment, because we have copies of that, but that is also made available to members of the public if they want to look at the certificate holder public summary. They see there's a risk, they want to know a little bit more about that, then it's referenced back into the National Risk Assessment. The period for consultation is 6 weeks. So we would receive it 2 weeks ahead of this and ensure that we have good list of the stakeholders for whatever region is or state is the sourcing is happening in. So for example, if it was Western Australia and Northern Territory, it may not be necessary to be emailing people in Tasmania, because we're very conscious of having emails focused to the right people. We all get those emails and they get ignored, and we want it to be as effective as possible. So to Nick's point also on just previously, we will also ask a certificate holder for a list of other stakeholders that they may consider applicable to their area. We use this, we compare it with our master stakeholder list that we spend a lot of time keeping up to date. Perhaps there's a new contact in an organization, perhaps there's a new entity completely that needs to be on there. So we will add those to the master stakeholder list, and the consultation is sent to everybody. My last point here on this slide is what happens with the comments. So in auditing, we have that 6-week stakeholder consultation period. So throughout the 6 weeks, we may receive comments via email or could be phone call or what have you, where interested parties make contact. The comments are recorded, but they're confidential. They're confidential to the certification body. They are not shared with the stakeholder, the certification holder. The comments then are given to the auditor who is assigned to this particular certificate, and the comments become a point where they are addressed as part of the audit. So some comments may require further investigation. There may be specifics about something, and the auditor will investigate this as part of their audit practices. Again, it is not shared with the certificate holder. There is a second public summary that the auditor does put together, where the comments that have been received are addressed, and they are addressed in very general terms to maintain the confidentiality of the stakeholder that took the time to raise a concern, or often they're positive comments as well. I mean, they can be from multiple different chambers, the 3 different chambers, and across the spectrum of going from positive to negative. So, and we are bound by our code of ethics in terms of confidentiality, and also under GDPR, the data protection regulation out of Europe, which has global consequences in terms of people's records and confidentiality and maintaining data. So, okay, all right. So we've come to the end of the presentation section, and we're moving now into the panel discussion. Just a quick reminder to place your questions in the question box if you have any. And we had a couple early on as well, so I'll pitch these if that's good in the interest of time, so we can keep going and make sure we finish on the button today. So the first question that we've received is, how do we use the high conservation value framework in the wake of large landscape changing events, such as example would be bushfires or climate change?
Yes, happy to answer.
Suzette, would you have a go?
Yeah. So look, in terms of that one, it's a big question, and it's obviously a topical question based on you know, the last fire season in particular, and you know what you know is predicted to happen in the future. I guess as forest managers and as sources of controlled wood, you know, essentially we need to take, you know, an assessment as a point in time, and it's based on best available information at that point in time. So from a, you know, high conservation values assessment perspective, you know, on a norm, you're assessing a particular forest area and values in that forest area. So something like bushfire clearly can have a you know, an impact within your forest area, could have an impact, you know, adjacent to your forest area and potentially change conservation status of species and the like. So what I would be suggesting there in terms of you know, that process and you know what you might expect would be, you know, a view on, you know, what impact that particular, you know, landscape level effect has had within a particular operation area. Has the bushfire burnt part of the area? Has it changed, you know, conservation status of particular species? If not, then I'd be saying, well, you know, your high conservation values assessment probably doesn't need to be reassessed. From my perspective, any which ways, but you know, clearly, if there is you know, that impact, then yeah, they'd need to look at those particular values and determine whether, in consultation with stakeholders and appropriate expert stakeholders, there's a change in the values within their forest area, and therefore a change in the control measures that they should be implementing around those particular values. Thanks, Kira.
Yeah, thanks, Suzette. We do have another question here about the scale, intensity and risk, and I will pop back up to that slide. I think it might be most helpful if you bear with me. It's not too far. Oh, there it is. Okay, it's a good question. So the question is, in the variation for low scale, intensity and risk, is it an either or in terms of that it has to be a plantation under 1,000 hectares and less than 5,000 meters cubed, or is it an or?
So this one, Kira, was quite considerable discussion, and this is obviously consistent with
Thanks, Susan. Yeah,
the national standard process. And it is an or, so it's less than 1,000 hectares. It must be plantation, full stop, and either must be less than 1,000 hectares or less than annual harvest volume of 5,000 cubic metres. And the rationale for the latter, and particularly the 5,000 cubic metres, is the basis that you could have a much larger supply area, but be harvesting on a very low harvest regime or very low level. So it is an option to have low SAR for either of those two categories.
Great, thank you. There's a question here. I think I'll be able to handle this one. It's a framework calls for stakeholder consultation in the assessment pathway, and what is the expected expectation for this stakeholder consultation? Does it have to be in accordance with Annex B? So this is a great question. Thanks to whoever brought this up. So the answer is yes. Stakeholder consultation is required for, how might I put this, for a variety of, or for several aspects of the high conservation value framework, which is outlining control measures for category 3. It does exist in, it may exist in other control measures elsewhere in other parts of the globe where it's a mandatory requirement. But the question is about the amount of stakeholder, or the expectation for the stakeholder engagement. So it is one of those things. It's kind of getting back to this scale, intensity, and risk. It's doing the appropriate amount of stakeholder consultation to determine conformance. So the minimum requirements for stakeholder consultation are outlined in the 40005 standard under Annex B, and it does talk about the stakeholder consultation process being adequate to the size and scale of the organization's operation. So earlier on we spoke about section 1 or indicator 1.4 in category 1, and about the stakeholder consultation requirement to ensure that there was a license or permit for harvest. So this stakeholder consultation is obviously going to be a smaller scale. It'll be going to the relevant authority or entity to be able to give evidence of said license and therefore conformance. There are some other requirements in Annex B, such as consultation must take place at least 6 weeks prior to the management activity of the subject consultation. The reason for this is that we don't have situations where, oh well, you know, the stakeholder consultation, we tried it last week and they haven't gotten back to us, and then, you know, the operations have started, and you know, then you're not going to have an adequate evidence of conformance prior to the start of harvesting. So the metric of the 6 weeks is to ensure that there is adequate time and planning put into any of these management activities in order to reduce the risk of activities causing issues with either any of the categories of controversial sources. Does anyone else have anything on want to talk about that, or? Okay.
I think you covered it, Kira.
Yep. Okay. And again, it's Annex B in the standard, which helps with the types of consultation techniques that can be addressed or implemented, I should say. Okay. All right.
Maybe just briefly add that the annex also requires that a notification is sent to the local FSC office, so it will have to be sent to us, and we pop it on our webpage as well. That's a notification, a consultation notification.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. All right. Another question here. If a certificate holder is a small operation, what are the expectations around expert consultation when using the high conservation value framework? So this is a similar question that we had from our webinar for New Zealand, for the CNRA for New Zealand the other day. But this is, it's a very important question about smaller operations, because FSC, one of the drivers behind the controlled wood as well was to provide access to market for certain for smaller landowners with small holding forests, and being able to participate in the FSC program as well. So Suzette, would you be willing to?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so it's expert consultation, for the high conservation value framework and for smaller entities.
I think, there's as proportionate to the values that you're expecting and that you found within those areas. I think what's relevant here is the fact that in the Australian context, the low SIR is plantation, and it is fairly low volumes, either across a reasonable size or a larger area. I think in terms of stakeholder consultation, the values that you're likely to identify in those areas from a high conservation values perspective are probably reasonably limited, although there would be some that may potentially occur within those areas. And I think for those forest managers, it's really, it's stakeholder consultation that is relevant to obtain enough information so that you are implementing the appropriate actions around managing those particular values. So I think, it's trying to, as Kira mentioned, not create an overly onerous or significant constraint to certification for those, or access to certification or controlled wood for those managers, whilst putting in place, a provision for them to undertake or reach out to some experts around those management of those particular values and how what control measures might be appropriate for them. So it's a little horses for courses, but essentially it's that it's as reasonable and appropriate to the values that you're trying to manage in the location where you're sourcing from.
Great. And also in the FSC 40005 standard, you have Annex C, which talks about expert qualifications. And again, in there, it will outline the requirements for the particular value that is being protected, or that there's a control measure being implemented for. It doesn't necessarily mean that the expert has to be external to an organization. You may have several staff members who are, for example, in category 3, biodiversity experts, and then staff that are forest management experts as well. So there can be an expert process or consultation around that as well. And in terms of auditing, it's following that path, following that process, and being able to see how control measures were, determined, or their adequacy or implementation was assessed by an organization. Okay. I think everyone can tell I'm the only one with the access to the questions here. So we have a question about, does the NRA apply to wood suppliers that source wood? It does. So I guess that's a question about depending on where an organization is on the supply chain. So if you're further from the forest and you are a furniture manufacturer, or paper, or you're maybe in that kind of secondary processor realm, and you hold your controlled wood certificate, well then yes, the national risk assessment or your due diligence system will apply down the supply chain to the level necessary to ensure that any risk in your supply base or your supply area has been addressed. So that's where it can be complex. There's a lot of larger organizations with complex supply chains within Australia, outside of Australia, and there's a significant body of work that happens within an organization in order to be able to collect all of that information to ensure that it is all indeed low risk through either location, that it has been deemed low risk by the National Risk Assessment, through further investigation, or through the implementation of control measures. So all of that information has to be gathered in order to go to audit, and has to be presented at that audit to be in conformance with the standard and indeed be certified to controlled wood. Many of the organizations that have large, complex supply chains, and even the smaller ones as well. If you have suppliers and you're in the controlled wood scheme, there is a requirement of the standard to conduct an internal audit And as part of that internal audit, that is, you are going through your own checklist to determine all of these things that we're talking about. So with that internal audit, you have your auditor glasses on, and then when your external audit comes, you're presenting that as part of your body of evidence in order to be in conformance, along with some of the other environmental management system processes in-house. Nick, did you want to add anything on the supply chains?
Nothing further from me, Kira.
All right. Well, we've addressed most of the questions here that I can see. There's still a last call as usual. No question too big or too small. I do have a question here actually on. Oh, okay. It's to do with Category 4. Why was Category 4 specified risk for plantations? Could it have been low risk for plantations and specified for native forest?
So for that one, I guess the information showed that there is a potential risk associated, and a specified risk associated with plantations. So the National Risk Assessment Working Group worked through the process of compiling all the known information. There is quite a complex process, as Stefan mentioned initially, around how the values are assessed and what process we go through to try and identify where it sits. We were fortunate in terms of many of the high conservation values or many of the values that we were able to, I guess, pick apart some of the the different states, and also, identifying potentially where there is a different risk associated with native forest and plantation. But for this one, the view of the working group, having undertaken that assessment, was that it's a specified risk for both native forest and plantation.
Great, thank you. And it's also that aspect of going from forest to non-forest use as well, which would build into that. And we're getting a couple of more questions here. Okay. Okay, so the one question here is about the internal audits. What aspects might an internal auditor look at in terms of their supply chain? Nick, would you be willing to start with this one? So the aspects that of an internal audit report, or what the environmental or the certification manager or whoever in an organization, the types of things that may be looked at in an internal audit.
Yes, well, when it comes for an internal audit, the certificate holder needs to ensure that they're implementing the controls in their own control wood program and meeting the requirements of their chain of custody system. So you really want to have someone that is competent in understanding the requirements of the chain of custody standard and the controlled wood requirements. You'd want to have typically a checklist that covers off the key control measures that have been identified and implemented for each of the indicators at the forest level, and as well as the supply chain level. Let's not forget the supply chain level. And when doing an internal audit, it's best to have someone doing the audit who is objective and impartial to the processes, so you're not assessing your own work, and to be collecting objective evidence or citing objective evidence in your checklist to say, yes, this is what I've checked, and this is evidence that we meet this criteria.
Great, thanks, Nick. I had a kind of a build-on question to this, which is a good one. That that internal audit is indeed looking at conformance in the supply chain and ensuring that control measures are in place as necessary, and that has been communicated down the supply chain. But this question is relating to certification body or going for an audit. You know, are all the same supply chain and supply units audited as part of that? Well, the certificate holder has the requirement under the standard that there's an annual audit of their suppliers. So that's your internal audit report, or internal audit, which comes out in a report. But in terms of us as auditors, we take a sample-based approach, because otherwise we'd be with you for half the year, I think, for some entities. But yeah, it's a sample-based approach of, you know, the suppliers, supply units, and suppliers along the chain. And that is, we get again, going back to this, 2 weeks before we have to do stakeholder consultation if it's an evaluation or re-evaluation. All of these things are being determined behind the scenes as to how many suppliers we may need to interview or visit with, or how many, if necessary, forest management units or field verification sites that we need to go to. So we have a list of everywhere that the product or wood has been sourced from, and then we apply a formula across that to get our sample size, and then the auditor is given their sample size to go ahead with the actual audit. But that, you know, that's not just controlled wood specific. That's for all of the audits across the standards. It is a sample-based approach. So we may be looking at delivery tickets, or, you know, purchase invoices or sales invoices. Again, a sample of those are taken. So the sample would be across time. It may be across, and additionally across different products. You know, the sample is going to tell us what, you know, whether an organization is in conformance with various sections of the standard. Sometimes the sample size is bigger, and it can make a difference between major or minor non-conformity, depending on whether it is or isn't in conformance.
Kira, also when selecting a sample at the forest management level, we would look at the forest types and geography, and whether they're FMUs or small, low intensity managed forests.
Yep.
And species, yeah.
Yep. Yeah, we try and get the best cross section that we can, depending on the operation. All right, well, we have no more questions here in the inbox. I can't believe it's exactly 2:30, or half past the hour, for those of you not in the same time zone. We've spent 2 hours with everyone here, and unless there's anything else, we'll start wrapping up. So thank you to everybody that came today. It's been a pleasure. It's great to get some questions in. Hopefully it was informative for you in terms of understanding the different documents, the different parts of the documents, and it doesn't seem so onerous a task. I have a lot of respect for everybody's work here, and yeah, that's it from me. Stefan, I'll hand over to you as FSC to say a few words.
Thanks. Yeah, and thanks to Suzette and the SES team, and Kira in particular, for making this webinar a reality, and like Kira, I hope that it helped people understand the control wood system and the national risk assessment and its documents and what the control measures are and how to use them. And then by all means, please get in contact. You've got my email address here if you have any questions about the national risk assessment or about anything in general. Yeah, just reach out. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you. All right. Again, so the recording will be sent to everybody who has attended or who had signed up. So it'll be there for further reference. And if there's any additional questions, send them through to Stefan, and Q&A sheet will be sent to all to help with your program or your auditing or your consulting. So yeah, wish you all the best, and stay safe, wear your masks.